Thank you very much, Tommy. Thank you for having me. Nice to be here, if somewhat inconvenient. I should say, first of all, I'll be following Twitter, so if there's anyone watching online who wants to ask a question, ask me on Twitter and I'll try and answer it. The second thing is, in a very meta way, you will of course understand that there are guidelines for how one develops guidelines called the RIGHT Guide, and we have tried to follow these. But first of all, a little bit of background. I came to this 10 years ago because I'm interested in neuroprotective drugs that we might use for stroke. And there was a drug called NXY059 that everyone thought was brilliant until it went into clinical trial. Well, it fell flat on its face. And when we went back with the benefit of hindsight and looked at the animal data overall were quite convincing, but high-quality studies that reported randomization and blinding and allocation concealment gave significantly lower estimates of treatment effect. And we published this eventually, and we were told that, well, the community knew that because stroke preclinical researchers were stupid, and that was a well-known fact, and people could have predicted this, actually. They all knew it already. So we decided to look slightly further afield, and we've got a thing called the research assessment exercise, which has now been renamed in a great bit of nominative determinism, the Research Excellence Framework, so you can guess what they're going to find when they report next. And they thought that research from the 5 leading UK institutions that I'm going to show you was really pretty good. They thought it was brilliant. And so we identified over 1,000 publications describing animal research coming from those leading UK institutions published in the 2 years following this very clever badge that they collectively got. And we looked at the reporting of 4 items which had been recommended in Story Landis's 2012 Nature Perspectives paper on transparency and reporting of in vivo research. Randomization, blinding, reporting, inclusions and exclusions, and whether or not there was a sample size calculation. These are the individual institutions. They're colour-coded to protect my future career prospects. Lovely Scottish blue colour there. But randomization in about 15%, blinding in less than 20%, inclusions, exclusions in 10%, and power calculations in 1 in 50 of these papers. So 68% of these papers did not one of these things, and 1 paper out of 1,173 did all of them. So it wasn't just stroke researchers, and there's a little way to go. And that's kind of launched 1,000 ships about how we might improve research. So first of all, there was the ARRIVE guidelines published in, I think, 2009, coming out of the UK NC3Rs, a rather long list of must-dos. And these were taken up avidly. This graph here is from NC3Rs from, I think, 2013 or 14, and there's now over 1,000 journals which endorse the ARRIVE guidelines. But David Baker and colleagues in 2014 and then Leung in 2018 looked to see whether the quality of reporting in those journals was any better. And they said, well, it doesn't seem to have been having any benefit yet. And the response came from a number of people in the community saying, well, what you've got to do is just enforce the guidelines. And someone who's been following Twitter will see that I kind of gave you a little preview of what happens when journals try and enforce guidelines. And then a little while later, because Shai's always slightly late to a party, Shai was a last author on this Story Landis paper, Call for Transparency, a little echo of that today, 7 years down the line. And that then led Nature, at that time under Veronique's leadership, to introduce this checklist for publication in the life sciences. So because or at least I aspire to be a scientist, we thought we should maybe test these things to see if they make any difference. So here's a randomized controlled trial of an intervention to improve compliance with the ARRIVE guidelines, which we called ICARUS. The PI was Emily Sena, who is brilliant in many ways, but she does not have a classical education. So she didn't realize why I'd called it ICARUS until after we had the results. She didn't speak to me for a week. So we took it in a completely blinded way. We took submissions to PLOS ONE. And we told people there was a study going on, but we didn't even say what journal it was at. And when the paper landed in the office in-house, it got randomized to standard care, which was, we endorse ARRIVE, please send us a checklist. Or enhanced care, which was, send us a checklist. If you don't send us a checklist, send us your checklist, otherwise it's going nowhere. So studies were randomized to normal handling or enhanced compliance, and then some of those manuscripts went through to publication. We randomized 1,600 submitted manuscripts over the course of 14 weeks. Clinical trialists in the audience, that's a good clinical trial to do, no worries about recruitment there. And then for those that made it through to publication, we said, did the intervention make a difference to this composite outcome of compliance with the ARRIVE guidelines, where you saw that before it was 1 in 1,000 in the UK. So We randomised about 800 in each group, about 300 got published. The intervention took in that 13 out of 322 people offered us a guideline if we asked for it nicely. And 301 gave us a guideline if we demanded it out of 340. So presumably there's some old timers going, don't you know who I am? I've submitted to your... I was with you at the beginning and still... so presumably that was... But then when the papers went through to peer review, even the academic editor handling the paper did not know a study was happening. So this is a very discrete test of does the guideline make a difference. So what happened with those accepted manuscripts for the arrived compliance? Nothing. Nothing. No difference whatsoever when our journal did the very best that it could do to enforce the guideline in a high-volume publication setting. So when people say you just need to get someone else to do this, it doesn't work. So Nature had worked, well, who knew? Nature had worked a bit harder, and if you hear, when Soumya talks about it, you can sometimes hear the pain in her voice about how much effort was required. And so we did this other study. This wasn't a randomized study, this was a before and after study where we took papers published in Nature journals after the change, we matched them for subject area before the change, and for each article we matched it using PubMed-related citations for a similar paper published around about the same time in a non-Nature journal. And we recruited about 200 in each group, and some were in vivo research and some were in vitro, and our primary was compliance with the arrived guidelines. And what you see, so in black you've got we randomised, and in green you've got we did not randomise, but at least I as the reader know that you didn't randomise, so I can make an assessment of the diligence of your finding, of the provenance of your finding. And you can see substantial increases in all of these, and overall 16% of papers afterwards did all of these things. Which one of the reviewers of this paper said, that's very low. I said, yeah, but it's very, very high, if you know this community, very, very high. And so this is the Landis 4 criteria, randomization, blinding, and the like for the ARRIVE study. And this is what Nature achieved when they had all that heavy editorial handling. So it is my question earlier on, it takes hard work, human effort, and endeavour to make things shift. So a checklist on its own is not enough. So when we came to think about an MDAR framework, we thought that we'd like to try and start off right at least and think about how we might evaluate it. So we've evaluated 289 manuscripts. 89 of those manuscripts were dual assessed by 2 independent reviewers. So this is the time taken in assessing the checklist, and the average time taken was 24 minutes by the editor doing the assessment, which I think is short. This is the cumulative percentage of checklist items that were relevant. So if there was an item about plant-based research, it would only be relevant to the plant-based studies. And so you can see that only 15 of 42 items were relevant for more than 50% of the manuscripts. And I think that's going to be the case with any guideline such as this that seeks to be overarching. In blue here, you've got the percentage where the assessors considered the item to be relevant. In orange, you've got the places where you thought it was met. And so here's materials, here's design, and if you look in design, these are the Landis 4 items which make it through to this, and you can see there's quite a lot of disagreement about, there's quite a lot of times they're thought not to be relevant, and where they are relevant, it's not actually being achieved, which is what we'd expect from what we know about performance across the way. This is the analysis section, and this is the reporting section. But then what's the agreement between reviewers? Some of you might know this statistic called the Kappa statistic. So if I toss a coin and someone else tosses a coin, 50% of the time we'll agree. And if we say we've got 50% agreement, that's great. Kappa subtracts out that agreement by chance, and what you can see here for the issue of whether these items are relevant is that for some there's clear agreement, and for others the agreement is not much better than it is by chance alone. A Kappa statistic of greater than about 40% is held to be pretty good agreement for things like this. And then so that is the item relevant, and then if both assessors agreed that it was relevant, is it reported? Did they agree on whether it was reported? And one of the interesting things for me in this in the take-home is that, well, first of all, it's a mess and there's not very much agreement, but secondly, even with looking at 89 manuscripts, there are too few to get confident estimates, of precise estimates of the agreement between reviewers, because there's wide confidence limits around these estimates. But agreement was limited in some cases, no better than chance. So authors and editors seem to like the checklist and seem to find it useful, although authors submitting to journals, manuscripts to journals are not always at their most critical of the journals. The time taken to check performance is short, and perhaps if it had been a bit longer than 24 minutes, the agreement between assessors might have been higher. Some checklist items are infrequently relevant, And I think that supports that some kind of dynamic checklist where you were channeled down into those questions that were relevant for you and also for a particular journal. There'll clearly be some that are never going to be relevant for you, so you can get a streamlined version. Agreement was limited, but I think we can look at the areas where the disagreement between observers was most and say, well, do we need to work more in the elaboration and explanation document? Do we need to rephrase that question to be exactly clear what we're asking about? And next steps are going to be a consultation with key stakeholders and interested individuals, and some of you in the room have agreed to participate in this, and then revision of the checklist items and the explanation and elaboration document and other materials in the light of that feedback. So thank you very much.